Welcome to Money Talks. I'm Nancy Stark, and with me here today is our professional financial expert, Deanna Booker.
Goodness.
Dee is a wonderful person. She knows all about money, and we're happy to have her here today. She's also the Communications and Community Outreach Manager for Consumer Credit Counseling Service of Maryland and Delaware. Now, CCCS, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is a 501c3 nonprofit agency that has offices here on the Eastern Shore. Do you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. We are offering all kinds of financial counseling, so budget counseling, credit counseling, housing counseling. We've been serving folks here on the Eastern Shore since 1966, just doing what we can to help folks become more financially stable.
Well, you are a wonderful organization. We're glad to have you here today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And today we're going to cover a topic that we've never covered on Money Talks before, and that is personal bankruptcy. And to lead us off, to kind of kick things off, we have an email from an Eastern Shore viewer. And Dee, why don't you read us a part of what they wrote?
I will. Here's what she wrote. She says, "Dear Deanna, I'm writing to you because I'm at my wit's end. This past year has been a very difficult one for my family. Last July, my husband lost a job that he's held for the past 8 years.
Wow.
For months, we've been living solely on my paycheck. Despite my husband's constant efforts, he hasn't been able to find a job yet. Just before the economy went south, we bought a new home, but now I'm afraid we'll lose it. We maintained the mortgage for months after my husband's layoff, but we aren't able to make full payments now. For the past few months, it's like we've been living on borrowed time. We've used up our savings and tapped into my 401k just to stay afloat.
Wow.
We have nothing left now but lots of credit card debt. We never thought it would come to this, but we're actually considering bankruptcy. Given our situation, does this seem like the best choice?"
Boy, Deanna, it does sound like they're really struggling.
I know.
There are a lot of people out there right now in this same situation.
Yep.
What kind of advice would you give? What is the best choice for them? Is bankruptcy good?
Right, and it's hard to know, and I pulled this email out just because it kind of resonated with me so much for this topic. I knew we were going to be talking about this, but honestly, it's hard to know. It's hard to know without knowing more about their full financial situation. Bankruptcy is a big step. It really is a big step, and it can have major consequences on your life going forward for many, many years. So the best thing to do is just learn about all of the alternatives that are available. What options do you have? That's the best thing to do in making a choice whether or not bankruptcy is the right thing.
Well, for people that are out there, like in this particular situation, what are the types of options that are available before you really look at bankruptcy?
Right. I think one of the first things you have to do is think about if making a plan of action for yourself is an option. The way to do that, and we talk about this all the time when I'm here, is it's starting by sitting down and really assessing your financial situation. So looking at your income, seeing everything that you have, what are your expenses, doing all those calculations, totaling everything up. Exactly, finding out where you stand financially first. Totaling all that up, doing that math, and seeing where you need to be, to be able to make ends meet.
Obviously, you're probably going to be short. What can you do in the case that it's obvious you're not making ends meet right now?
Right. So then that's where folks have to start looking at, well, where can we cut back? What kind of adjustments can we make to the budget to cut back on expenses? Can we, and you want to look at everything. So everything from groceries to car insurance. What are we spending on everything, and what kind of changes
are there
can we
ways
make?
We can reduce it?
Exactly. How can we reduce costs? The other thing, of course, is increasing income. So now I know this lady who was writing, her husband just lost his job, but maybe there's potential for somebody to work part-time or work overtime.
Additional.
Exactly, to try to increase income in any way that you can. Again, to be able to bridge that gap between what you have and what you're going to need to be able to make ends meet before you make the decision to file bankruptcy.
In other words, try and pay off what you owe.
Exactly.
What happens in the case that you can't do it on your own? What's next?
Well, I think next you may want to look into debt management. I think that the next step for a person to take is getting that outside help and finding out if you qualify for debt management, like we offer at Consumer Credit Counseling Service. Having that counseling, talking with one of our counselors, going through, letting us evaluate your situation, and finding out if a debt management plan might be good for you. In our debt management plan, the way it works is we would combine, all of a person's debt, they would make, or their unsecured debt, I should say, they would make one payment to us monthly, which we would then distribute to their creditors. Once a person comes into a debt management program and they make 3 consecutive monthly payments, creditors are going to be willing to make concessions. So they might lower interest rates. They might stop charging late and over limit fees. And that might be enough, to make it affordable where a person would be able to pay their debts back on their own, again, without having to file bankruptcy.
That makes sense.
Right.
And one thing I should say here is, we talked about before that CCCS is a nonprofit organization, and that's probably one of the things you want to make sure of. If you're doing debt management, that it's with a reputable nonprofit agency.
Absolutely.
And another route that I've heard that people sometimes take is debt settlement. How does that work?
Well, debt settlement, it's different, obviously, than debt management. In debt settlement, you are negotiating with your creditors for them to accept less than the full balance of what you owe. So you're working with creditors to try to get them to take less money. You're not paying off the full debt. And it's complicated. Debt settlement is a complicated process.
What are some of the things that can happen?
Well, one of the largest things that a lot of times folks don't know, if you settle a debt, there may be tax implications. You may have to pay tax on the part of the debt that's forgiven. The IRS looks at it sometimes like unearned income.
That makes sense.
Right, and so it's something that people don't know. So you get into a settlement, and depending on how much a creditor kind of knocks off of what you owe, like I said, you might have to pay tax on that money. So it's complicated. It's a complicated process. If you're going to go that route, though, I always suggest to people, try working with creditors on your own, not going to a debt negotiation or a debt settlement agency.
Why is that?
Well, just because it's risky. And one of the main things about debt settlement agencies is that the fees that they can charge can be astronomical.
Wow.
Astronomical. And they're not going to do anything for you really that you couldn't do for yourself. So if you want to attempt to negotiate with your creditors, you can do that. Get it worked out, do it with them directly, and just make sure that you get all the terms of any settlement that you agree to in writing.
So we aren't really talking about agencies when we're talking about debt settlement. We're talking about companies.
The companies,
a
exactly.
for-profit organization.
Exactly. They're absolutely interested in making a profit. That is their first concern.
Okay. Well, we've talked about the options that might be available outside of bankruptcy. If none of those work and bankruptcy is the only option, why don't we go on and talk some about bankruptcy?
Okay.
What exactly is involved with personal bankruptcy?
Personal bankruptcy is a petition. It's a legal proceeding, or you might hear it referred to as a petition, that is going to be filed in the United States Bankruptcy Court. It's a large and complex process.
So we've talked about some of the options that are available to people before they really consider bankruptcy, given that it's a really sober decision to make.
Right.
Let's talk about personal bankruptcy itself. Exactly what's involved.
Sure. Personal bankruptcy is a legal proceeding. You might hear it referred to as a petition that's going to be filed with the United States Bankruptcy Court. And if granted a discharge, a person is going to be granted a discharge from the obligation to repay their debt. Now, bankruptcy is not a free ride, even though it is a tool, and it's a viable tool sometimes for honest folks who are, struggling under debts that they can't repay. It's
Make a
tool.
fresh start.
Exactly. It's a tool to make a fresh start, but it is not a free ride. Bankruptcy is going to stay on your credit report for 10 years.
That's a long time.
Exactly. So it can truly, truly have an impact going forward for quite some time. And it's a, like you said, it's a sobering decision. It's a sobering thing to have to come to. The bankruptcy code is divided into chapters, and that's probably something that a lot of folks are familiar with. Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 are the two most common chapters when it comes to personal bankruptcy.
Let's talk a little bit about each of those. What exactly is involved when we talk about Chapter 7? What is that?
A Chapter 7, you might hear that referred to as a straight bankruptcy or a liquidation case. In a Chapter 7, your assets are going to be evaluated, and they're going to be broken down, and they're going to be categorized as exempt and non-exempt assets.
What's the difference?
Well, an exempt asset is an asset that you are going to be able to keep. It is going to be exempted from just what the word implies, from the bankruptcy. A non-exempt asset won't. And so there may be property that is going to have to be forfeited, things like that are going to go towards the repayment of your debt. Maybe.
In other words, they're going to take your property, sell it, and take the proceeds from that and apply it to what you owe other people.
Exactly. But those determinations are made by the courts and by the trustees. So a means test is done to determine, how much it compares your income, your assets, the things like that that you own to national benchmarks to determine how much you really can afford to repay, if anything. So that Chapter 7 it's a holistic kind of bankruptcy, for lack of a better term.
That's what they mean by straight.
Exactly.
How exactly
everything.
are your debts discharged under Chapter 7?
Well, if you cooperate with the trustee, if you do everything that you're supposed to, all of that kind of thing, all of the debts that are put into that bankruptcy are going to be discharged. You are going to be relieved from your obligation to pay them, or to repay them, I should say, under the Chapter 7, as long as you follow with all of the steps that the trustee and the court set out for you.
That's interesting. How about a Chapter 13? How does it work?
Now, Chapter 13 is different. You might hear that called a wage earner plan.
Okay.
In a Chapter 13, again, the means test is going to be applied, and the courts are going to determine how much you can afford to pay. Because in a Chapter 13, you are going to repay some, and in some cases, all of the debt that you owe. The courts are going to set up for you, or for a debtor, a repayment plan, a pre-established repayment plan for either 3, 4, or 5 years. And you're going to pay that monthly payment each month over that time period until the debts are repaid.
That's interesting. I've heard in some cases that even though the debt might not be fully discharged, that bankruptcies are granted. What kinds of situations does that happen in?
That usually happens when a debtor is unable to continue with the pre-established, payment plan for circumstances beyond their control. So it's not just because, we don't feel like paying anymore. Exactly right. But circumstances beyond your control. And the other thing that occurs kind of along that same line, Chapter 13s, again, depending on the circumstances, depending on the situation, are able to be converted into Chapter 7s, and you're able to receive a discharge that way. So it really does just depend on the debtor's personal situation.
Oh, that's interesting. And you mentioned that there's a means test, so obviously that qualifies you for, if you can file for bankruptcy. Who decides if you can or can't, and what type of bankruptcy you qualify for?
Right, you're absolutely right. That means test is kind of the striking post that the courts are using to determine whether or not, just like you said, if you're going to be allowed to file at all. They may do that means test and determine that no, you don't qualify to be able to file any chapter of bankruptcy. So it's different than it used to be. It used to be that a debtor or consumer determined what chapter of bankruptcy they wanted to file. It's not that way anymore. Now the courts, the trustees, are determining if you can file, and if you can, which chapter you can file.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, going along with that, do you have to have an attorney to file for bankruptcy?
You don't have to. It's not a requirement that you be represented by an attorney, but like we've said a couple times, it's such a complicated process.
Yeah, it's not an easy process.
Right, and especially with the new laws, I just always suggest to folks that if you can get some legal advice, it really does pay. It really does help as you go throughout the process. Now, getting legal advice and hiring an attorney can be very, very expensive, but I just really think that the cost is worth it because, again, it's such a process.
You want to know what you're going through.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, for those folks, though, that are in a situation, I mean, obviously, they don't have a lot of disposable income already, or they wouldn't even be considering bankruptcy, probably. Are there other options available other than attorneys?
There are. There are a group of folks that are known as petition preparers, and they will assist you with preparing your bankruptcy paperwork and that kind of thing. The thing about petition preparers is, and they're all around the country, you can find their services all around the country and even on the internet. The